Our other challenge would be to determine the regionality of the quotations, whether through the setting of the story or the background of the author, and then to see whether the regions we assigned in Volume 1 entries still seem appropriate. Because we hope to have students or volunteers regularly assist editors in doing internet searches, we plan to use the current exercise not only to see what citations could be found, but also to test the process of training and evaluating students' assistance. We would keep records of the time they spent on the project and keep a list of their findings, annotatings, post-datings, and regional labels.
The two students we hired, Lindsay, an undergraduate, and Erin, a graduate student, were both very bright and computer savvy. They worked the first 3 days on the project in my office and were encouraged to ask questions. I explained the basics about DARE and about the project, and I checked on their work. We started them on the same 4 terms in order to compare their methods and results. And we started them on the 2 Making of America websites and American Memories. When they completed these, we gave each student an expanded list of terms and websites. After those 3 initial days, they could work when and where they wanted to, but we were in touch by email and by phone. They turned in results frequently and received feedback on them. Lindsay and Erin used sound strategies for their searches, and they asked good questions about the process, but their questions and their assumptions pointed out how important it is for us to specify every step of the procedure and to write rules that don't allow multiple interpretations. If we want to date an 1875 quotation, for instance, we have to be content to have them consider only pre-1875 examples. Even if we were to do this ourselves, we would not exclude an 1880 example on date alone if it happened to be an extremely useful or instructive quotation. Anyone who has done much internet searching will readily appreciate that what one student finds is not necessarily what another will find, even if they are searching on the same day. Idiosyncrasies and changes in internet sites, differences in search strategies, and inexplicable glitches yield different result sets for any 2 people. These are difficult realities to accept for those of us trained in the traditional mode of using citation files where what we see is what we have. But the rich yield of the internet means that these kind of frustrations must simply come to be seen as part of a day's work. At one point, Erin could access nothing on one of the sites. I was able to point him to another search button, which worked. I myself searched a particular website in vain for a citation given me by Lindsay. I finally ran it to ground by searching just the one newspaper and limiting my search to the title of the column for the given day. The term was there, but I could never get it by searching for the term itself. At the end of the 6 weeks period, we interviewed both students again, individually, for their input on the project. When asked which 4 or 5 sites were the most useful, they agreed on 4 out of 5. Each student mentioned both Making of America sites and concluded that newspaperarchive.com was essential despite, as one said, its horrible OCR, its awful search engine, the lack of proximity searches, and the extremely annoying tendency of the site simply to stop working for significant periods of time. Indeed, the broad range of otherwise inaccessible newspapers and the deep chronological coverage it covers from 1753 to 2004 made it a good site for us. And both students chose LexisNexis for post-dating. One added Google, while the other did not spend much time with it. She said that it had so much junk that it was hard to cut through it, although Boolean searches I helped some. Her conclusion was that ProPress was good for post-dating without the hassles of Google. One ended the list of helpful sites with Write American Fiction, while the other mentioned that Write did not seem very helpful. Documenting the American South was somewhat useful, they said, while JSTOR was less helpful. We were somewhat surprised to find that both students concluded that the Library of Congress's American Memory was not very useful, since DARE editors used it regularly for Volume 4 and found it productive. How did these evaluations square with the actual results of earlier and later datings? 15 of the 28 words, or 54%, have been antedated. 20, or 71%, have been post-dated. NewspaperArchive.com provided 5 of the earliest citations, and Write American Fiction and Documenting the American South provided 2 each. Others provided 1 each, as shown on our handout. Of the post-datings, LexisNexis provided 13, ProQuest News and Magazine 7, and Google 2.
Our remaining challenge was regionality. Assigning regional labels to citations found on the web proved more difficult than with our normal written sources. Google, for example, yielded a manageable number of hits for contemporary usage for a phrase like holler cat broke, but it wasn't always possible to determine the regionality. So it's always a relief if you find a quote like this, quote, "I know we fought the North Korean and Chinese armies to a standstill and made them holler CAFRO. This is a term used in Texas for I give up," end quote. But that's pretty rare. A next best case is something like this, quote, "It's been mired in debt, kicked in the gut by runaway sponsors and stomped by declining attendance, but El Paso's Southwestern International Livestock Show and Rodeo isn't about to holler CAFRO," end quote. One can assume that the writer is, if not a Texan, at least reflecting Texas usage. A sometimes effective strategy is to send a quick email query to the writer of a Google hit who's not identifiable by context. One such interchange emphasized once again how important it is not to make any assumptions. In my query, I said that the DARE evidence showed that holler CAFRO was used chiefly in the Gulf states and the South Midland. The man's response was, "Dear Ms. Hall, I found your unexpected message an absolute sparking delight, but I'm mildly curious how a traditional, thoroughly Texan phrase could have migrated to Southwest Asia. Oil patch Texans in the 50s, reckon? So I guess Gulf states no longer means what it used to mean." Enough examples of holler CAFRO show that the term is still used chiefly in the Gulf states and South Midland, so our regional label still holds. For the other words we tested, we found generally similar results. That is, most of the additional quotes that we found and could apply a regional label to, whether antedatings or postdatings, were from the south of the South Midland. The evidence was particularly strong when the DARE maps showed dense and compact distributions of informants. The map for Adams House Cat, for instance, is beautifully concentrated in the South Atlantic and Gulf states, with only 3 outliers among 89 informants. Our newly found evidence shows that the term is still markedly regional. Not surprisingly, however, in cases where the DARE maps were more diffuse, we were more likely to find new evidence outside the South and South Midland. The map for airish, meaning inclined to put on airs, is a good example. Although our 18 informants were chiefly in the South and Midland, the pattern was just suggestive rather than definitive, and our electronic searches turned up evidence showing that the word was used more widely both earlier and later. That was also true for cat, meaning the top of the berry. An instructive lesson for us in looking at the new data was that while a map can be a beautiful illustration of the distribution of a response to a particular DARE question, it may be only a part of a larger semantic picture that we didn't know about 20 years ago. The entry for behind a dime is a good example. Our evidence came from DARE in answer to the question, about a deceiving person or somebody you can't trust, you might say, "I wouldn't trust him," blank. We had 28 responses of the type, "I wouldn't trust him behind a thin dime, behind a dead dime edgeways, or behind a straw, behind a knife, pin, or a corkscrew." We called it an adverb phrase and defined it at all in the least, as in I wouldn't trust him at all. What we discovered with our recent searches is that this notion is part of a larger pattern of phrases of distrust and cynicism hinted at by the informant who couldn't trust him behind a corkscrew. The electronic sources yielded a wealth of citations of the type, "He's so crooked he could hide behind a corkscrew." Obviously, the underlying notion is similar, but these phrases don't work with a definition like at all or in the least. So we'll certainly redefine this entry when we work on a revised edition.
Doing this exercise has pointed out the difficulties of incorporating such internet searches in the already full jobs of DARE editors and of relying on students or volunteers to do the searching and to evaluate both the websites and the individual citations. The most daunting conclusion is that to have editors do this kind of searching regularly is simply not an option. The time required to search even the most productive subset of websites beyond what they are presently doing would slow the editorial progress to an unacceptably slow rate. The students spent a total of 156 hours looking only at these 28 words. We had thought that they would have been able to search many more terms in that amount of time. Bottom line, to put it in business terms, each antedating or postdating required an average of 4 3/4 hours. We will need to develop a carefully structured program that allows students and volunteers to do as much research as possible and pass it on to the editors. The hardest part for all of us will be to accept the facts that we can't have it all and we can't do it all. Some marvelously informative quotations and some extreme antedatings will doubtless languish out there in the ether while we work to meet a deadline. Thank you.